Hi there, welcome to another burst session. This one is about planning and designing, and it is part of our K-5 Inclusive Practices in Mathematics series. My name is Janice Nowakowski, and I'm your host today. I'm one of the district teacher consultants for K-12 Mathematics and Numeracy. So in this series, we've been talking about what inclusive practices in mathematics look like, and some of the practices and principles that we draw upon as we're thinking about planning and designing for inclusive mathematics, so that all students have access to learning mathematics in different ways. So we're going to build upon students' funds of knowledge and their interests, the strengths and things that they bring from their community, their families, their culture. We're going to create up learning environments that nurture belonging and community, are a positive space for mathematics learning. And we're going to both present and represent mathematical ideas in different ways and through different models when we're teaching. And so sometimes we have to think about, well, what are some different models for fractions? What are some different models that I'll use for subtraction? What are some different models that will be effective to use for introducing multiplication? So we're conscious in our planning about what models and representations we're going to be sharing with our students. We create choices and opportunities for students to learn in different places and spaces and with different students and peers. And they have those choices for their learning throughout the week. We're also going to create choices and opportunities for students to work with and think through different materials, different tasks, the range of numbers that they might be working within, and different access to tools and technology as well to support their learning. And then we're also going to create choices for different ways for students to represent, communicate, and share their learning. And again, that can be at different times and places and spaces as well. So when we think about assessment, it all doesn't have to happen on the same day and at the same time. Children need different opportunities to show what they know and what they can do. So we need to design for that in our plans within a lesson, within a week, within a unit of study. So when we think about universal design for learning, we think about these core ideas that we just accept that there will be learner variability in the class. It is the rule, not the exception. We have a range of learners in our classes, how they like to learn, what they like to learn with, and then the different strategies and approaches that they may take. We also have firm goals. We have a learning goal for the whole class, and then we have individual goals for students as well. And we want to encourage students from a very young age to be more metacognitive and aware of what they need to learn and what they need to practice, and what number range is appropriate for them. Just like in literacy, choosing a book that is going to move their reading forward. It's important for them to be aware of those just right texts that they need to choose. Yeah, so I think that's all I'll say about the firm goals, but I think that metacognitive piece is really important so that students aren't just thinking that they're completing tasks. Well, I played this, or I did this, or I finished that. It's about I was practicing this, or I was learning this, and shifting that sort of narrative from task completion to a focus on learning. And then finally, core idea is learner agency, which again ties that metacognition in there, and students understanding themselves as learners, removing biases and barriers to student learning. That's why that class profile is so important. And then making sure that we have opportunities for students to advocate and make choices for themselves. So the work of Katie Novak and Ashley Marlowe, they recently published a book on UDL in mathematics for kindergarten to grade 5, and then there's a new one coming out for secondary and middle school, but they talk about multiple means of engagement. So physical engagement, social engagement, cognitive engagement. How do we ensure all students are able to participate in some way? Multiple means of representation. So all those modalities, when you're teaching something, are we using oral, visual, written, physical models and representations to help students learn and understand mathematics? And then also multiple means of action and expression. And that's how students take up the mathematics and show us what they know and what they can do. Some of the resources that we've drawn upon for this series, and again, there's the K-5 series and a complementary grade 6 to 9 series with Shaheen Musani. We've been looking at the work of Dr. Rachel Lambert in Rethinking Disability in Mathematics, the UDL in Mathematics book, and then also looking at culturally responsive pedagogies and honoring the students and who they are and what they bring to our classrooms. So first steps when planning and designing, we need to think about ways to nurture a positive learning environment in mathematics. We need to position ourselves and position students as competent. And so sometimes that requires us to check our language, check our biases, check our assumptions, and make sure that we're positioning the students that we're learning with as being competent. And then as educators, we also need to build our own conceptual understanding around mathematics. In math, it's called pedagogical content knowledge. Better understanding the mathematics for the age of students that we're working with. So grade 4-5 teachers really need to build their understanding of fractions and of multiplication and division and all those different strategies and models for that. Kindergarten and grade 1 teachers really need to focus on building their conceptual understanding of counting and tens and ones, and that's teen numbers and all the complicated learning that goes around with that. And then, so that first example, how do we nurture a positive learning community in mathematics? We've talked about these things in other sessions for this series, and you can go back and watch those recordings. They're all on the Numeracy playlist for our district YouTube channel. But talking about how do we make students feel like they belong to mathematics, that they see their identities represented in the materials, the resources, the context that we use for math problems, that there's representation in the books and the materials and the languages that we use, that we are nurturing a positive classroom community and bringing community together through discourse. And mathematical discourse is a little bit different than other types of discourse. It's a lot of explaining and justifying and proof. And so we want to make sure we're creating a positive culture where children aren't shaming each other or dissing each other, that they're like, oh, that's an interesting idea, or I'm going to build on so-and-so's idea. And that listening and responding to each other's ideas and making connections. A big part of habits of mind and dispositions that come in to a positive math community are taking risks and perseverance. And so we need to model that as educators and make sure that we know the students know that we value that. Oh, like who has an idea? Let's just give it a go. Like it doesn't have, like some students get really stuck and they want to be correct. And so we need to really find ways to nurture that risk taking and sticking with a difficult problem. Making sure that students have access to ideas, materials, and tools in the classroom in different ways, visual models, vocabulary, glossaries, concrete materials, and tools. And then different ways and timelines for students to show what they know and can do. And I've mentioned that already a few times. In our curriculum in British Columbia, under all the learning standards, there's a little bar that talks about habits of mind and dispositions. And these are some of the things that specifically are relevant for mathematics when we think about dispositions: perseverance, risk-taking, collaborating and learning from others, and that's a really positive thing. That's the work that mathematicians do. They very rarely work in isolation. Students having positive math identities about themselves and that positive self-talk that they do, and us modeling that for them. Problem solving, that is the essence of mathematics. So making sure that students are having opportunities to do problem solving regularly, not just at the end of the year or not just on Fridays. And not just at the end of a unit, for example. So problem solving and making connections to daily life, and then nurturing flexible thinking. And I talk to parents a lot about this, how this is so important in mathematics. And when we get rigidity, that really closes students' minds in terms of their flexibility and fluency with numbers and operations. So nurturing that flexible thinking and like, who has one way to do this? Who has a different way? What other ways can we do this? And making sure that as educators, we're nurturing that idea that flexible thinking is important and is valued. And then, of course, in mathematics, accuracy is also important. It's not just about 4, it's 2 and 2 is 4. And so there's also that time when we have to yes, we need to be more accurate. We need to make sure our calculations and our computations are accurate, and that is the goal, is pursuing accuracy along with flexibility and fluency. So when we think about planning and designing for math learning, we're going to talk a little bit about providing access and providing choice for our students. So 3 steps to increasing accessibility from Katie Novak. Determine the high priority concepts in each grade. And so as educators, we learned about this in the spring of 2020 when we thought about what are those high priority or those foundational concepts. And maybe we don't need to worry about this or, what's the difference between a regular and irregular polygon, but we really need to make sure students understand multiplication and division or addition and subtraction. So looking at your grade level and really realizing what is high priority and making sure that students all have access to those high priority concepts, because those are what is really important for them to continue their mathematics learning from year to year. Accessibility is also provided through scaffolding and different types of scaffolding. Sometimes it's the math that we're scaffolding, the conceptual scaffolds. Sometimes it's the socio-cultural scaffolds, who they work, where they work with, how they collaborate, whether it's playing a math game or using a non-permanent vertical surface and solving a problem together in groups of 2 or 3. And then linguistic scaffolds, including vocabulary or glossary, visual charts in the classroom, or access to technology for speech to text or text to speech or translations, or creating a visual model as well. And then again, this importance of the power of problem solving, making sure that students aren't always just doing naked math, that there's contextualization and connections to their daily lives and problems that mean something to them. So that can create accessibility for all students. In our representation session from last week or the week before, we talked about the importance of representation and planning. So I mentioned this earlier. When we're planning a unit of study, we need to think about what models and representations are going to be effective for our students. And I was just working in a grade 4 and 5 class this morning, and we were thinking about fractions. And, actually, we often use the circle or the pizza or the pie visual for fractions, but those slices are actually really abstract and hard to compare in terms of area or size, whereas the fraction bar or the rectangles are much more, students are much more able to compare fractions and think about composing and decomposing fractions with those models and materials as opposed to the circular model. So just some things to think about as the educator about what models are going to be effective for the students that you're teaching. Again, providing access in your planning. We all have a range of learners in our classrooms, so begin with the meta big idea. For K to 9 around number, it's number represents quantity. For grade 4, it's fractions. For kindergarten, it's numbers to 10. For grade 3, it's numbers to 1,000, but it's still all that meta big idea is numbers represent quantity. And so students can have access to, whatever math that you're doing through that big idea. Developing both a learning goal and a language goal in our planning. Language we're really realizing is really important for our students. There's specific academic vocabulary that's important to mathematics that we develop when we're engaged in doing mathematics with them. Using all sorts of modalities when we're teaching, and then again, nurturing that student agency and metacognition. Some choices, we've talked about the math buffet quite a few times, and that sort of draws upon Katie Novak's work around UDL2, is that idea of here's the buffet of materials. You choose what's going to work for you instead of me telling you what strategy or tool or material you're going to use. And again, that's where that student agency comes in. It doesn't work for all children. Sometimes the choice can be overwhelming. And I've worked with lots of students like that. So sometimes it's like, here, 1 or 2, here's 2 materials. Which one do you think you would like to use today? And we're putting those constraints on, those enabling constraints by providing 2 choices. They're still having choice, but it's not too overwhelming. Again, access around tools and technology. It may not always be an iPad that they need access to, but it could be 10 frames or number lines or 100 charts or 100 grids, whatever it is that they need that will help mathematize some of the materials that they're working with. They can choose the range of numbers that they're adding or subtracting, and you can do that through dice. They can just choose the type of dice, whether they're decade dice or century dice or just regular 6-sided dice, provide some choice in the numbers that they're practicing with. The context, choice of context connected to their interests or connections. And that's where problem posing and storytelling can come in, students connecting mathematics to their own interests or daily life. The practice tasks, to include open questions in those, not always closed questions. So what different ways can you solve this? What are all the different ways you can represent this number? Are open questions. providing choices with what, with who, where, and when students are doing math, the representations, and then how they communicate and share. So I have one example here that I'm going to share. I'm just going to check something up here first. Okay, just wanted to make sure I didn't miss something in the chat. This is an example with a grade 4 and 5 class that was visiting the studio for 3 different lessons around multiplication. So the teacher and I did some planning, and old school, we printed out the learning standards and we highlighted the learning standards for grade 4 and 5 that we were going to focus on. So for content, multiplication facts to 100, multiplication to 3 digits, and then we looked at the curricular competencies and we looked at what fit for those particular content areas, but also the teacher said, I haven't done a lot of problem solving. I haven't done a lot of open play or inquiry. So I need to do more of that. So we added that particular curricular competency into our planning. And then we looked at the proficiency scale and really we thought about, okay, so what will it mean to be proficient in these things? And so starting with that end in mind, so we know that's the goal, that's what we're working towards. We developed a learning goal that encompassed all those content and competency standards. And then we put it in student language. So, and we had that up on the board so that students would know what they were working towards, what the learning goal was. We practiced on describing the proficiency and thinking about that together. So what will mental math strategies look like at grade 4 and 5 around multiplication? And so the two of us talked about that. And then we talked about what particular indicators of proficiency will we look at for multiplication of 1, 2, and 3-digit numbers. And so we broke it down into sub-concepts, and these are all the things that we will need to teach or develop because that is part of the goal in terms of where we want to get to. And then from that, we developed a proficiency scale, and this is the one that is on RichNet for district use. And so it describes, again, what the students will be able to do when they're proficient. But this is the full scale, so it also shows indicators for emerging, developing, and extending. And then we looked at the teacher's class and talked about the students and what strengths do they bring to this particular unit of study. Do they have a strong sense of number already? Were they strong with addition and subtraction? So we can make some connections there. Do they like to use physical materials or concrete materials? What needs do the students have? So being mindful of the supports that they will need. And then what interests do they have? I didn't know the students very well. So it's like, what could we use that we could bring in to some of the planning that we're doing? And then because this was around multiplication, we pulled up some different resources. Marion Small's key book, Making Math Meaningful, which is at DRC, as well as in many of your school libraries. The Number Talk books, which have all the multiplication strategies, and then some math games to practice multiplication, numberless word problems, Number Hive. If you're not familiar with those games, those are wonderful for practicing addition, subtraction, and multiplication. And then the boxcars and one-eye jack games as well. So then we planned the learning experiences. We planned some number talks and, the strings of questions we would use. So again, here's the example from in the studio for 8 times 243 and all the different strategies that the students built up over a couple of lessons and shared. We also did a core competency focus. And so thinking about communication and creative thinking. And creative thinking is really about being flexible and thinking about different ways and building on each other's ideas. So that connected really well to multiplication strategies. We planned different learning experiences. Again, for students, a lot of students in this class like to draw and enjoyed art. So we had paints out and we had drawing on the windows. And then they were also able to use concrete materials. You see the little buffet of math materials there on the table. And then little whiteboards where they could draw and share their different strategies. And then we had our little clipboards and we were assessing as students were doing these different things. There's a little video there. So Shaheen and I have done up some planning and designing templates, and they will be posted on RichNet soon. This is the K-5 one, and again, just has a list of supports there for you to consider when you're planning different units of study. Some are more conducive to some topics than other topics. And again, just has all little boxes. You can print it out onto an 11 by 17 paper. That's how I kind of like to do it and write all over it. Some people like to use it on their laptop. It has the place for a learning goal or goals, a language goal, some information about your class, what instructional strategies and structures like math workshop or number talks will you use for this particular unit, and then some task ideas for student learning and assessment and some questions to consider. And then Shaheen's for grade 6 to 9 looks like this, and she's still working on that, but they'll both be posted on RichNet. So this is just sort of a list from those templates. So again, some people like something to write on, some people just like the prompts. So we'll also provide this on a one-pager, just to sort of, as you're planning and designing for learning in math, just some things to be mindful of and remember and think about. All of these resources will be on the Inclusive Practices tile on the Numeracy Foundations Framework pages on Learn 38 on RichNet. So just as we finish up, thank you for joining us today for this burst. I'd like you to consider what representations and materials will support student understanding of the mathematics, and to consider that when you're planning and designing for learning. What instructional strategies and structures will you include in your planning? And what different ways will students be able to show what they know and what they can do? Thank you.